The Capcom vs. games, be it Marvel, SNK, or Tatsunoko, all have cool characters. Terry Bogard, Tekkaman Blade, Psylocke, there's no shortage of incredibly sick characters that can do equally sick things. But on the badass hierarchy, there's one character that stands above them all. Strider Hiryu is the product of a joint collaboration between Moto Kikaku and Capcom. Capcom initially approached the company for this venture, and the result was a three-pronged project. A manga produced by Moto Kikaku, a tie-in game to the manga developed by Capcom for the Famicom and NES, and a standalone game for the arcades, also done by Capcom. Both Capcom games had completely different development teams that didn't really share much info with each other, so both games ended up being wildly different. The NES game was a loose adaptation of the manga, sharing characters and settings, while the arcade game featured an original plot, setting, and even a separate design for Hiryu. The arcade game went on to become the biggest success of the three releases by far, becoming one of Capcom's most popular games of that year, which says a lot considering that DuckTales and Final Fight came out that same year. It was a big enough deal that the 1990 Sega Genesis port, an arcade port of that quality being a rarity on home consoles at the time, was probably the biggest system seller for the console prior to Sonic the Hedgehog. The series stars Hiryu, a member of the Striders, an elite worldwide organization of assassins. Striders, Hiryu included, all have their real names, their age, and their nationality classified and are dispatched on missions across the planet. I should note that the creation of the Striders have been implied to be related to Zeku in Street Fighter V. While not outright confirmed, Street Fighter V heavily hints that the group Zeku goes on to form after his character story goes on to become the Striders. We'll see if that ever gets expanded upon though. In every game in the series, Hiryu is usually stated to be an A-class Strider, the highest rank and specifically stated to be the youngest Strider to ever reach that ranking. He's a professional in every sense of the word. All that matters to him is fulfilling his mission. He's a man of very few words. The NES game, being more tied to the manga, has a slightly more involved story. In the manga, Hiryu had retired from the Striders after having to undertake a mission that involved him killing his older sister, who had gone insane and murdered several trainee Striders in cold blood. This slid Hiryu into a deep depression, no longer valuing his life, and becoming more reckless on missions in the hope that he'd die in battle. This eventually led to his retirement. He'd be forced out of retirement by a Strider named Matik, who would task him with killing another fellow Strider, Kane, a former comrade of Hiryu's. The NES game picks up from here, and though it diverges from the manga in some specific ways, both the manga and the NES game shared the twist of Matik being evil and plotting Hiryu's downfall. Weirdly enough, despite being based on the manga, which had obviously not released outside of Japan, the game's Japanese release was cancelled, making it a rare example of a Capcom game that only released in the US on the NES. The arcade game's popularity saw it get ported to other platforms like the aforementioned Genesis port, the Master System, and the PC Engine, the latter notably having expanded cutscenes and an exclusive desert level not in any other version of the game. Aside from the terrible US code produced non-canon Genesis sequel made under license from Capcom, Striders slowly faded into obscurity, occasionally showing up to cameo in Capcom's quiz games, or memorably as a character in the background of Ken's Alpha 2 stage. That is, until 1998, where Strider made his grand return as a playable character in Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes, sporting an updated version of his manga and NES design as opposed to his arcade outfit. Strider's character design and flashy but effective moveset immediately made him a fan-favorite character among fighting game fans, and he'd largely become a mainstay in Marvel vs. Capcom going forward. He uniquely fights with a plasma cipher which he wields similarly to a tonfa, his slashes making a distinctive high-pitched sound when he attacks, something carried over from the arcade game into his fighting game appearances. Strider's kind of unique in that his popularity in Marvel vs. Capcom has directly led to his series being resurrected not one time, but on two separate occasions. The warm reception to him in Marvel 1 directly led to the development of an official Strider 2 sequel for arcades and PS1, and the outcry to his absence in Vanilla Marvel 3, and the overwhelmingly positive reception to his subsequent inclusion in Ultimate, led to the development of the highly underrated 2014 reboot by Double Helix. How many other characters in the series can say that? Strider's voice actor in the first two Marvel vs. games is Yuji Ueda, who also voices Jin in the same games as well. He also voiced Vega in Alpha 3 in the Capcom vs. SNK games, Claude in Star Ocean 2, Rikuo, Lord Raptor, and Tao Bane in every Darkstalkers game, Brock in the Pokemon anime, and most notably, has been Blanca's voice actor since Alpha 3, still retaining the role even in Street Fighter 6. Strider's history, perhaps more than any other Capcom character, is distinctly intertwined with the Versus games, not just for how they've affected his series, but also because of the person credited for his inclusion in Marvel 1. Someone that, as it turns out, not only made Strider a notable name again, but is also responsible for a lot of the Versus series' identity to begin with. Atsushi Tomita joined Capcom in the early to mid-1990s. His first projects was as an assistant planner on X-Men Children of the Atom and Marvel Superheroes, joining the teams midway through both games' development, working under Capcom staff such as Akira Nishitani and Takeshi Tezuka for X-Men and Marvel Superheroes respectively. Tomita was promoted to the role of lead planner when it came time to start work on the next game, X-Men vs. Street Fighter. According to Tomita, Children of the Atom, at least internally within Capcom, was seen as something of a lost cause because of its design elements atypical to the genre. Big screen-filling super moves, teching throws using meter, pretty much everything with a low enough hitbox being an OTG, it's kind of easy to see why. With that in mind, Tomita felt he had a bit more freedom to get experimental with the gameplay systems for X-Men vs. Street Fighter. In his words, his goal was to create the best game possible within the development limitations placed on him. To that end, he conceptualized a new feature for the game, and incidentally the feature that would go on to define the Versus games, tag fighting. Instead of simple one-on-one fights, you chose two characters who can be switched on the fly with heavy punch and heavy kick, and can even initiate team hyper combos. X-Men vs. Street Fighter is often credited alongside SNK's Kazuna encounter for being the first dedicated tag team fighters, both games actually coming out within days of each other in September of 1996. That said, the first known game to my knowledge with a tag team mode is Fighter's History Mizoguchi Kiki Ipatsu on the Super Famicom, which featured the multiplayer tag team mode and released about a year before both games. Tomita went on to serve as lead planner for the following game, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, which despite its somewhat black sheep status among the early Versus games, spawned the other mechanic the series would come to be known for, assists. Marvel vs. Capcom would be his next project, and with the decision being made to expand the roster past just Street Fighter, Tomita pushed for one character in particular. Tomita, at his own admittance, was a big fan of the original Strider game, having played a ton of it during his days as a student and lobbied for his inclusion in the game. He also initially wanted to include Lancelot from Knights of the Round and Ravel from the King of Dragons as assists, the latter actually making it to the concept art phase, but decided against it so as to not fill the game with too many of his personal wishes. Another cut assist, this one actually having sprites made for it, is Tomichin. This one is actually a caricature of Tomita himself, affectionately designed by his peers. He appears in the game's secret file flyers as well, but was ultimately cut because they didn't want to get in legal trouble due to his resemblance to a certain Muppet. The Strider series in general has a pretty big presence in Marvel 1, which we'll go into in a bit, and Tomita is likely responsible for the lion's share of it. After Marvel 1, Strider's popularity blew up to the point that Capcom was willing to greenlight a full-on sequel to the game. However, the game ran into some problems during development, and given his passion for the character, Tomita was appointed as a planner midway through development. Something he noted was a telltale action done when the game's development was in trouble. The game almost faced cancellation again, but Tomita and the development team pushed through, though the game's development was unpleasant enough that he said that his brain actively rejects any attempts to recollect any detailed memories of that time in his life. Tomita would then go on to work on Mobile Suit Gundam, Federation vs. Zeon, and perhaps most notably, the highly underrated Gotcha Force, a game Tomita stated that he's perhaps most proud of along X-Men vs. Street Fighter. He left Capcom not too long after, becoming an assistant production manager at a few anime studios, and currently writes for the anime Gento Mangekyo, The Memories of Phantasm. But the legacy he left for the Versus games is unmistakable. We quite literally wouldn't have the series as it exists today if not for him. All that said, let's get into Strider's Marvel vs. Capcom appearance. Strider's theme in Marvel vs. Capcom 1 is a remix of the Stage 1 theme from the original arcade game. The fanfare that plays before the song starts in the arcade game is incorporated into this arrangement at the beginning of the song, and is arguably the most iconic part of the composition these days, showing up in every other arrangement of this song in other games. One interesting thing to note about this arrangement is the key it's played in. It doesn't match the original arcade version of the theme, but is instead played in the same key as the Sega Genesis rendition of the song. Again, I can't stress enough just how much of a landmark title the Genesis port was, so it wouldn't surprise me if more people were familiar with that version. Strider's a pretty fantastic character in Marvel 1. He has great normals and a ton of offensive options. He has fantastic mobility with his double jump and Excalibur, and he's capable of some pretty impressive rushdown. However, he has pretty low health, you need some pretty great execution to play him optimally, and he has lower average damage compared to a lot of the cast. Still though, Strider is an especially capable character in spite of these shortcomings. The vast majority of his moveset is taken from various abilities and power-ups he can receive in the original arcade game. He has the ability to wall jump, as well as the ability to perform a double jump. An interesting thing to note about Strider's move names is that most of them are borrowed from the names of various mythological weapons and concepts over history. This is something Capcom would revisit moveset-wise again with Tekkaman Blade's move names in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. We'll talk about them as we go along. Strider has a unique command normal, a slide done by hitting down forward and heavy kick. This slide is taken directly from the original Strider game. It could be used offensively there as well. Strider's first special move is Ame no Monokama, done with a quarter circle forward and punch. This is a rushing slash forward whose distance and strength varies based on the strength of the punch button pressed. The name is taken from the mythical sword Ame no Monokama no Tsurugi, though it later became to be referred as Kusanagi no Tsurugi, or a grass-cutting sword, and is one of Japan's 3 sacred treasures. If that sounds vaguely familiar as a fighting game fan, that's because the same treasures form the basis of the items of the same name that play a role in the King of Fighters series. His second special move is Excalibur, done in the air with a quarter circle motion in either punch or kick. The punch variations travel upwards at varying angles, while the kick version does the same but downwards instead. The move name is taken from the mythical sword of the same name from Arthurian legend. Gram is a massive slash with Hiryu Cypher done with a dragon punch motion in either punch or kick. The punch variation hits normally, while the kick variation has Hiryu crouch while performing it. The punch variation can be done in the air as well. Gram is a weapon from Norse mythology, and is specifically the sword said to have slain the dragon Fafnir. Sometimes, depending on the tale, the sword is referred to as Balmung. Castlevania is another video game series that's regularly referenced the weapon. Warp is a teleport Hiryu can perform by doing a reverse dragon punch motion in either punch or kick. The light, medium, and heavy versions all teleport him to the same position, but its height is dependent on whether or not you use punch or kick. The punch buttons send him a little high into the air, while the kick variations keep him closer to the ground. Vajra is a teleport kick done with a quarter circle back and kick. The light version always goes to the left of the screen, the medium version in the middle, and the heavy version to the right. Depending on the religion, Vajra is meant to either be a sacred tool used in rituals like in Tibetan Buddhism, or a pronged weapon as told in Hinduism. Formation A is done with a quarter circle forward and kick. Hiryu summons a robotic tiger that runs across the screen, hitting the opponent as they pass them. This is taken from the arcade game, where Hiryu can utilize tools known as options to dispatch enemies. The more options you collect without getting hit, the stronger they become. The strongest option that can be attained is option B, the tiger. The animal-centric options in the original game were inspired partially by The Legend of Kamui, a 60s manga series where the lead character summoned dogs and birds to attack enemies. Formation B is done with a sonic boom charge motion in Punch. A small circular drone will appear behind Hiryu for an extended period of time. If you input the motion again, Hiryu will send the drone forward as it turns into a fairly large projectile. This can uniquely be done in the air. This appears to be a uniquely powered up version of Option A from the original arcade game. The way it functioned in the original game is also represented in his moveset, but we'll talk about that a bit later. If you're an avid arcade game connoisseur, you likely think of shoot-em-ups like Gradius when you think of the term option, and there's merit to that here. The designer of the original Strider arcade game, Koichi Yotsui, was inspired by shoot-em-ups of the time when designing them. Option A in particular was inspired by the bit from R-Type. Yotsui would leave Capcom not long after, and in the mid-90s land at Mitchell Corporation, where he'd develop a spiritual successor to Strider, Cannon Dancer Osman, a game that until very recently has been incredibly rare and hadn't had a console release. If you enjoy the original Strider arcade game, I highly recommend playing it. Doing the same sonic boom motion, but with a kick instead, summons Formation C, which has a robotic bird fly in and drop a bomb whose position is determined by which kick button you pressed. Like Vajra, light deploys on the left side of the screen, medium in the middle, and heavy to the right. This move is a combination of two things from the arcade game. The eagle is Option C from the original game, where it swoops down and attacks enemies. The bomb that it drops is actually taken from a stage hazard in the game's second stage, where Hiryu has to traverse floating platforms while avoiding them. Heki Hadisuki is done with a quarter circle back and punch. Hiryu leaps to the wall behind him and clings to it. On the wall, he has several unique options. He can hold up or down to ascend or descend. He can press down in any kick to do a sliding heel kick downwards. Pressing punch has him do a cipher slash. And the pressing kick has him perform a pretty fast dive kick off the wall. He also gets an interesting mobility tool, allowing him to switch between walls by pressing back and forward. This move is taken directly from the arcade game, where Hiryu has the ability to climb walls in much the same way. The move name is more commonly called Wall Cling, but in Marvel 1 and 2, it's officially named Heki Hadisuki, or Cage Climb, sharing the exact same name as Vega's fence climbing move in Street Fighter. Strider's first hyper combo is Ragnarok, done with a Dragon Punch motion in 2 punches. Hiryu rushes forwards, and if he connects with the opponent, launches them into a brief cinematic super.
Marvelous!
The move is, of course, named after the Norse concept, where a reckoning consisting of various natural disasters and conflicts will eventually result in the deaths of various Norse gods. His second hyper combo is Ouroboros, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 punches.
Wonderful! Marvelous!
Hiryu summons 2 options that circle around him, and every time he attacks, the options fire off circle-shaped projectiles. This is a short but extremely sweet install super that's infamous in the series for its incredible lockdown ability. With the right assistant setup, Strider can easily take off a huge amount of damage by popping this just once. The way the options function here is more or less identical to how Option A functions in the original Strider game. Ouroboros is a symbol dating back to ancient Greece that depicts a snake eating its own tail, forming a circle in doing so. The circle can represent many things, not the least of which is the cycle of death and rebirth. Keep that concept in mind throughout this video because it's going to become a lot more important later on. Strider's third hyper combo is Legion, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 kicks.
Great!
Strider summons, Legion of his robotic animal option to swarm the opponent. It doesn't do all that much damage, but damn if it doesn't look cool. Legion is generally a word used to describe a great number of something amassing, but it was also used as a term for the Roman army. Here are Strider's colors in the arcade version of the game. And here are his exclusive colors in the PS1 port of the game. Strider, like Mega Man, also has a unique KO animation that mirrors the animation that plays when you lose a life in the original arcade game. As I mentioned earlier, Marvel 1 has some Strider representation beyond Hiryu's inclusion. Tong Pooh, misspelled as Tong Pooh in Marvel vs. Capcom, is a member of the Kunyang martial arts team made up of herself and her older and younger sisters, Pei Pooh and Nong Pooh. Employed by the main villain of the Strider series, Tong has unwavering loyalty to her employer, with the only thing burning fiercer is her battle skills, being by far the most capable of her sisters in battle. She attacks in the original game with her signature backspin kick attack, which produces a similar visual effect to Hiryu's own Cypher Slash, and this is what's used as her assist attack in Marvel 1. Tong went on to become a surprisingly popular character among Strider fans, and apparently Capcom staff. It can be reasonably inferred that Atsushi Tomita was a fan, leading to her inclusion here, but veteran Capcom artist Akimen has also stated that her design also influenced the creation of an even more iconic character, Chun-Li. Tong's probably the only character in the Strider series with the most appearances outside of Hiryu himself. She appears in both official Strider sequels, Strider 2 in the PS1, where she and her sisters are fought high in the sky among city traffic, and in the 2014 Metroidvania, where she and her sisters are now part of a group known as the Four Winds, with a new character serving as their leader. Here, Tong is known as the East Wind. She's appeared in other crossover games. She appears in both Namco Cross Capcom and Project Cross Zone 2 as an enemy. She's a card in SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters, appears in Felicia's Capcom Fighting Jam ending, and appears in Teppen alongside her sisters, sporting her redesign from the 2014 game. I mentioned this in the character video for Saki, but it probably bears mentioning here too. Her player to assist color is a nod to an optional fight against her and her sisters that can be initiated in the original game's final stage, where she instead dons a black costume as opposed to her trademark green outfit. The cutscene after the boss fight with her and her sisters in the OG game is also referenced in one of Strider's Winquotes as well. To guarantee her selection in Marvel 1, hold Start, Light Punch, and Heavy Punch during assist selection. Neo St. Petersburg is the stage that represents Strider in Marvel vs. Capcom. This stage, much like his theme in the game, is based off of the first stage from the arcade game, taking place in a fictional futuristic version of Russia. Specifically, this stage takes place in the Kazakh Federation, an analog to the Kazakh SSR that existed during the Soviet Union. These days, it's now known as the independent state of Kazakhstan, though most Strider media uses the former name, since the OG game released before the Soviet Union's collapse. The stage name is also a carryover of sorts from the original game. In real life, St. Petersburg was the Imperial Russian capital city once upon a time. Strider's designer Koichi Otsui later admitted in a 2014 interview with Edge magazine that the dev team hadn't actually seen what St. Petersburg looked like in real life, and worked from what they thought it might have looked like instead. The setting as depicted in Strider actually doesn't look anything at all like St. Petersburg, something Yotsui was surprised to find out when he saw footage of Kazakhstan years later. There's a blimp in the background that hangs out in the middle of the stage with some figures inside, likely military personnel. To the left, there's some girders with some peculiar pods sitting on them. These are the laser pods that can harass Hiryu throughout the ascents in the first half of the stage in the original game. The searchlights that persist in the original game's level background are also present here, along with some neon laser signage that spell out the city's name in Russian, as well as AD 2048, a nod to the first game opening with these details upon starting the level. To the far right, there's a fairly unassuming building, but I want to draw your attention to the emblem on top of it. This is the Kazakh Federation half-star, the country's emblem as depicted in the original game. If you look at about super jump height, you can see the moon, and more curiously, what looks to be a floating fortress in front of it. This is the third moon, the location of the original game's final stage, and the base of operations for the game's main villain, Grandmaster Meio. I'll have more to say about those two things later on when we get to Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, because they're much more relevant to that game's scenario overall, but do keep them in mind for now. Here's Strider's Marvel vs. Capcom 1 ending. Strider's ending in Marvel vs. Capcom is very similar to Captain Commando's ending in the same game, in that it's a recreation of the ending of their respective games. Both the original arcade game ending and the Marvel vs. Capcom ending end with Strider hitching a ride on a whale, even keeping the same shot perspective. Also interesting to note is that the ending theme from him in Marvel 1 is a triumphant remix of the Stage 3 Amazon theme from the first game as well. Strider doesn't change too much moveset wise in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. He does benefit a lot from new system mechanics like delayed hyper combos and selectable assists though. Delayed hyper combos in particular give him a way to safely pop Ouroboros to begin his lockdown offense. Strider's Marvel 2 presence is a little more specialized thanks in part to a certain character. He pairs incredibly well with Dr. Doom's molecular shield assist. His mobility is still pretty great, and Ouroboros combined with the aforementioned Doom assist gives him great lockdown capabilities. That said, he still has low health, he struggles when not paired up with Doom in a lot of ways, and he still requires decent execution to get the absolute most out of him. It really can't be overstated enough just how integral of a partner Doom is for Strider. Ouroboros combined with Doom's molecular shield assist can keep you in near perpetual block stun. It's an incredible pressure strategy most famously employed by legendary fighting game player Clockwork in particular. Moveset wise, his only real changes come in the form of his formation special moves. Formation A is now exclusively done with a quarter circle forward and light kick. And he has a new Formation A variant now, which sends out the bird. It swoops down similarly to the way it attacks in the first arcade game. The bomb formation is still here too, still on the same input as before. Strider's first assist is Ame no Munakama. His second assist is Vajra. His third assist is the Eagle variant of Formation A. Here are all of Strider's colors. Overall, Strider makes the jump to Marvel 2 pretty well. Before we start Marvel 3 proper, I want to highlight another Capcom crossover fighter, and specifically one that didn't get released, Capcom Fighting All-Stars. This was meant to be a 3D fighter meant to take place in Metro City, starring various Capcom characters and a few original creations, most infamously Ingrid. I bring it up because Strider was actually set to be a playable character in the game, which would have been his first 3D appearance ever as far as I know. Of course, the game didn't do too well at location tests and was eventually canned, and the scraps of the concept got retooled into the entirely unremarkable Capcom Fighting Jam. Moreover, we know now from two separate interviews that Capcom Fighting All-Stars was also cobbled together from the assets of another cancelled Capcom fighter, Capcom vs. SNK 3. meaning there's a pretty good chance that Strider was already on the roster for that. What could have been, right? That said, Strider did get into the third Marvel vs. Capcom game, though not initially. He was notably absent from the game's vanilla release, arguably the game's biggest omission outside of a Mega Man lead character. And yeah, people complaining that a widely popular character isn't in a roster isn't unheard of. See the no mai no buy controversy in the King of Fighters 12. But outside of that, I can't think of too many times where the outcry for a character's absence was this large. You even had FGC folks making videos begging them to add him back in as DLC. As for why Strider got left out initially, the messaging for that's always been kind of conflicting. Seth Killian, then Capcom community manager and also special advisor for Marvel 3, is quoted as saying that it was a licensing issue regarding Moto Kikaku that kept him out. In a separate interview with Ryota Nitsuma, the game's producer, Hiryu, in his words, didn't fit with the concept of the game, which is kind of vague? The thing is, by most accounts, Moto Kikaku have generally always maintained a good relationship with Capcom. According to Andrew Szymanski, a former Capcom producer and specifically the lead producer of the 2014 Strider game, Capcom actually outright owns the character, and the Moto Kikaku copyright is included as a formality to thank the company for their initial involvement in the character. He went on to say that Moto Kikaku have generally always been pretty receptive of any time Capcom's gone to them with a desire to use the character for something. When asked about the statements Killian made prior, Szymanski speculated that there might be a little more red tape involved when involving him in a crossover with multiple characters, as opposed to a standalone game, saying quote unquote, it either works or it doesn't. So was it licensing or a lack of interest that kept Strider out of vanilla Marvel 3? The world may never know, but it doesn't really matter since he got into the game's ultimate release, being one of the first revealed characters for the expansion. From this point onwards in the series, Strider's voiced in English by TJ Storm. He's done a good amount of voice work in games, being Marduk's voice actor in Tekken, Agnes in Devil May Cry 4, Brad in Dead Rising, Josh in Resident Evil 5, Edgemaster in Soul Calibur 5, and Birdie in Street Fighter 5, to name a few. Yuji Ueda reprises his role as the Japanese voice of Strider here as well, though he doesn't return for Infinite as that game lacks a Japanese dub. Strider's theme is once again a remix of the Stage 1 theme from the original arcade game. It's pretty close to the Marvel 1 version in terms of key, which means it also sounds like the Genesis rendition of the song as well. Strider is a character with really pronounced strengths and weaknesses in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. He's a really good anchor position character. Vajra is a fantastic assist, and Ouroboros is an incredibly overwhelming level 3 super, one of the best in the game. However, to offset that, he has incredibly low health. He needs X Factor to function optimally, due in part to really harsh minimum damage scaling on his combos, and for as good as Vajra is, if he gets hit out of it, it could mean death thanks to that low health. Like the previous games, Strider has the ability to wall jump and double jump. Most of Strider's moveset translated pretty seamlessly in the Marvel 3, though the inputs on some of his moves, notably his formations, have been simplified. He has a command normal, Arch Cut. This one notably used to be his standing heavy kick in previous games. His command slide is back as well. Ame no Mudakama is back and done with a quarter circle forward and attack.
I don't think so.
The attack, like in previous games, goes farther depending on the strength of the attack button pressed. This attack also notably causes a ground bounce now, giving it more utility. Graham is done with a Dragon Punch motion and attack. He doesn't have the low variant anymore, but this version now has slightly more startup in exchange for far larger range and the medium and heavy versions having wall bounce properties. Excalibur is done with the quarter circle forward and attack in the air.
First attack.
It's been consolidated into 3 buttons now, with the light version traveling downwards, the medium version going straight ahead, and the heavy version traveling upwards. Strider's formation animal summons have been condensed into a single motion here. Quarter circle back and light summons the tiger. Medium summons the eagle. And heavy has the eagle drop a bomb a bit past the middle of the screen. Quarter circle back and the special button is the new input for Formation B.
Attack!
Like in previous games, repeating the motion while it's active will fire the projectile. This move now notably hits OTG, allowing for some solo relaunches. Vajra is now a consolidation of his teleports and his teleport dive kick. The light and medium variations are teleports, teleporting above and in front of the opponent, and above and behind respectively, while heavy hasn't performed a teleport dive kick directly above the opponent. Wall Cling is now a quarter circle forward and special, and like before has different actions that can be taken depending on the button pressed. Light is the sliding kick, medium is the cipher slash, heavy is a dive kick, and special is the wall transfer. Strider's first hyper combo is Legion, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 attack buttons.
There's no escape.
Strider is unique in that he has 2 level 3 hyper combos. The first is Ragnarok, now made into a traditional level 3 cinematic super.
Sweet! Time to win this! Ragnarok!
His other level 3 is of course Ouroboros. Just looking at it makes it easy to see why this was now buffed into a level 3. The orbs travel incredibly fast and do a ton of chip. In level 3 X Factor, Strider can make a large dent in entire teams thanks to this move. It should be noted that Strider doesn't gain meter while Ouroboros is active though. Strider's first assist is Ame no Mudakamo.
Farewell. I don't think so.
His second assist is Graham.
Farewell. Farewell. I don't think so.
His third assist is Vajra.
Farewell. Farewell.
This is his most commonly used assist. Strider's colors in Marvel 3 are all meant to be shoutouts to other Capcom and Marvel ninjas. Color 2 is stated by Capcom to specifically be a send-up to the Hand, the resident Marvel ninja faction. Color 3 is based off of Kenji, one of the main protagonists of Capcom's Red Earth. Color 4 is based off of Strider Hien. We'll talk more about him later. Color 5 is based off of resident Street Fighter ninja Ibuki. Color 6 is based off of Guy from Final Fight. Gets even cooler in hindsight when you factor in the Zeku connection that later be established. Strider's alternate costume is the outfit worn in the very first arcade game. It might not be readily apparent, but the Strider in the first game and the one in Strider 2 are 2 separate people. Trust me, I'm going somewhere with all this hinting. Here are all of Strider's character interactions.
Something I don't like about you.
Strider Hiryu?
Run crying back to your masters. I am the hunter. You are the prey.
What chance do you have? Guns!
Don't worry. I'll punish the guilty. Prepare yourself to meet Cypher's edge.
You should run while you can.
Garrett!
Your weapons are too good for the likes of you.
Strider's Winquote against Frank is interesting because it's actually entirely different in the Japanese version. There, he mentions that he heard of the events at Willamette and praises Frank for managing to survive the 72 hours. This is made more significant by the fact that Strider in general is a much more curt character in Japanese, so acknowledging Frank's resourcefulness and resilience is a massive sign of respect on his part. Shoutouts to Rednecked Crake on YouTube and Twitter for giving me permission to reference their translation work for Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and Capcom vs. SNK 2. Here's Strider's ending in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Let's take a sec to look at this ending because there's some really good cameos here. Strider and Wolverine are being faced down by the Reavers, a private military group of cybernetically enhanced warriors. They're being led by Lady Deathstrike, who assumed control of the Reavers on several occasions. Even cooler is who Strider calls in for backup. On the left, we have Forge and Cable, and above them, a rare appearance of Pepper Potts in the rescue armor. On the right, you have Deathlock and what looks like Slingshot, who originally debuted in Brian Michael Bendis' Mighty Avengers, and went on to become a central character in Jonathan Hickman's Secret Warriors book. Last but not least is probably the most wild cameo, Death's Head. Death's Head is a bounty hunter that probably has one of the wildest canonical storylines in comic book history, because several key parts of his backstory and how he came to the Marvel Universe is rooted in crossovers. He was originally intended to be introduced in Marvel's then ongoing Transformers comic book, but realizing that doing so would legally make him a Transformers character, printed a one-page backup story introducing him in various other books, establishing him as a Marvel character so that Hasbro couldn't get their hands on him. He bounced around that Transformers continuity for a bit before ending up in the Marvel Universe thanks to the Doctor, yes, that Doctor, where he's had various run-ins with the Marvel cast. I guess the Capcom universe can be added to the list of universes he's interacted with now. Strider showed up again in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, and Capcom seemed to have learned a lesson this time because he's thankfully on the base roster. His theme is once again a remix of the Stage 1 theme from the original arcade game, but it's very noticeably in the same key as the original CPS-1 rendition of the song rather than the Genesis version. I actually kind of dig this version of the song, to be honest. Like most characters returning from previous games, Strider has a few changes going into Infinite. He has a new hyper combo that can be done in the air. Ouroboros is back to being a level 1 super, and his Tiger and Eagle formation inputs are made a little easier now. Unfortunately, his health is still on the lower end. Ouroboros is a lot slower compared to in Marvel 3, and as usual, suffers from harsh damage scaling, particularly with his light punch. A lot of moves that were consolidated into one motion in Marvel 3 have largely been reverted to their inputs from Marvel 1 and 2. Lateral Slice is done with forward and light punch. This is his old standing medium punch. Down forward and light kick is arch cut. This is his old crouching medium. He still keeps the slide he's had in every game prior. The Tiger formation is now a command normal, done with forward and heavy punch. This one also differs a bit from past games. Instead of being a traveling hitbox while it's on screen, it leaps on the screen first before becoming active and running forward. This has some utility as a grounded combo extender. The eagle formation is now done with forward and heavy kick. Like the tiger formation, the eagle comes on screen and stops for a quick second before becoming active. Hiryu can also perform a lateral slice in the air as well. Ame no Munakamo is more or less back to its Marvel 1 and 2 input by being a quarter circle forward in punch. Unlike the Marvel 3 version, this doesn't cause a ground bounce. Instead, it causes a knockdown state that can be comboed off of. Excalibur is now closer to its original input again, being done with a quarter circle forward in either punch or kick in the air. Light punch goes downwards, heavy punch goes slightly upwards, light kick goes slightly downwards, and heavy kick goes sharply upwards. Gram is no longer a dragon punch motion, but instead a quarter circle back in punch. This retains the wall bounce capabilities of the Marvel 3 incarnation. Vajra has had its input changed to a down-down motion as opposed to a dragon punch like the previous games, but can now be used with punch and kick, with the button determining which teleport is used. Light punch has him teleport above and in front of the opponent. Heavy punch goes above and behind them. Light kick actually teleports him to the wall and initiates his wall cling. And heavy kick is the teleport kick we all know and love. Formation C is done with a quarter circle back and light kick.
Detonate.
This functions about the same as it does in Marvel 3. Formation B is done with a quarter circle back and heavy kick. Like in Marvel 3, doing it again will fire the projectile, and it can still function as an OTG. Wall cling is done with a quarter circle forward and light kick. Like previous games, he has several actions he can do in this state, though one has been changed somewhat. He can still do the sliding kick, as well as the cipher slash, and the dive kick. He doesn't have the wall transfer anymore though. Heavy punch now does a leaping downward slash that ground bounces and can be used as a cross-up if spaced properly. Legion is done with a quarter circle forward in 2 punches. Strider gets a new aerial hyper combo in the air, Bryanak, done with the same motion as Legion but in the air. Hiryu does a flurry of quick, hard-hitting sword slashes. This move keeps up the tradition of his move names being named after weapons, though Bryanak's history is interesting in that it doesn't actually stretch particularly far back. For a while, it was thought to be a reference to a spear in Celtic mythology. Recently though, it's been hypothesized that Bryanak may have been a Japanese invented name for the spear, as it's a name almost exclusively used in Japanese produced media, this game included. What complicates things further though is that the first known use of this name in pop culture is in a Michael Moorcock fantasy novel from the 1970s, so who knows what came first. That said, even considering what the move is named here, this is actually taken directly from a special attack that can be performed in Strider 2, Savage Slash. Pressing down, up, and attack initiates it in Strider 2, and it does a decent chunk of damage. Learning when and where to use this move is the difference between merely surviving Strider 2 and mastering it. Ouroboros has also had an input change, now being initiated with down, down, and 2 kicks.
Formation.
This is now a level 1 again, and while it's still a pretty decent move when paired with active switch, the orbs are far slower than they've been in any previous game. Ragnarok remains his level 3 here and is done with a quarter circle forward and 2 kicks.
Cut you. Maxima. That's in it. Die. Secret technique. Ragnarok. Cut you.
Here are Strider's colors. Color 2 seems similar to the Guy-inspired costume from Marvel 3, but with the belt and armor up colors made white. The red with the yellow emblem calls to mind his unlockable second color from the PS1 port of the first Strider game though. Color 4 is once again based on Kenji from Red Earth, though now his hair is white instead of blonde. Strider's alternate costume in Infinite is Strider Hien, the secondary antagonist of Strider 2 and rival to Hiryu in that game. Prior to the events of Strider 2, the Strider organization was sabotaged and nearly all operatives were wiped out, Hiryu being the only survivor. Hien, a fellow Class A Strider and former comrade of Hiryu, was suspected to be the culprit, having grown jealous of Hiryu's strength. He not only betrayed the Striders, but was responsible for the resurrection of Grandmaster Meio, kicking off the game's events. It's clear that he still holds Hiryu in somewhat high regard though, warning his peers that Hiryu isn't to be taken lightly, and even tries to find a way to convince Hiryu to come to the Grandmaster's side instead of fighting him. However, they do end up fighting and Hiryu defeats him. He uses a unique geometric cipher, which can be split into two and used as boomerangs of a sort. Completing Strider 2 unlocks him as a playable character to use in the PS1 port of the game, where he largely plays similar to Hiryu outside of his boomerangs and lack of a boost mode. Hien is referenced in the 2014 game as well, through the game's Fallen Strider notes. These are reports from Striders that have fallen in the attempts to defeat Meio. In this continuity, Hien had not only remained loyal to the Striders, but was also the one that had made it farthest in his mission, having actually infiltrated Meio's stronghold, though he fell in battle to him. Finding this report unlocks his color scheme to use in the game. He was also intended to be an unlockable character in the game, but was taken out late in development. He was meant to be a new game plus mode of sorts, starting out stronger than Hiryu at the start, but being a bit weaker than him by the game's end. Hien also appeared in Namco Crest Capcom, more or less reenacting his role in Strider 2, attempting to resurrect Meio and reluctantly fight Hiryu in the Third Moon. Color 2 is once again based off of Kenji from Red Earth. Color 3 looks vaguely reminiscent of Lin Kurosawa, but I'm pretty sure they would have colored his hair brown if that was meant to be the reference. Color 4 seems based off of his second color in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Next, I want to touch on some story stuff for Hiryu, because there's actually some really interesting stuff here in Infinite, believe it or not. But first, we need to talk about a certain Grandmaster. Grandmaster Meio is the main antagonist of the Strider series, being involved with every game with the exception of the NES entry. According to the original game's designer, Koichi Otsui, Meio's design was actually inspired by the Lord of the Rings, with the name Meio in particular being the Japanese translation of Dark Lord, in reference to Sauron of the same series. His true origins are actually unknown in the Strider series. He's a being with godlike power who suddenly appeared on Earth and quickly overtook the planet. In the first Strider game, Hiryu is dispatched to assassinate him and end his rule, which he does, but not before sending the likes of the Kunyang trio and the bounty hunter Solo in vain attempts to defeat Hiryu. He antagonizes him in cutscenes over the course of the game, even getting in some lines in the game's final level.
All sons of old gods, die!
Meio's remains were kept intact though, and at some point in time transferred to an ancient burial chamber in a region known only as El Dorado. 2,000 years after the first game, Strider Hien, having betrayed and destroyed the Strider organization, seeks out the ruins and successfully resurrects Meio, though he's now permanently bandaged, his eyes glowing from behind them, no doubt from his original encounter with Hiryu. He once again attempts to take over the planet, confident that with the Strider organization gone and the only known survivor under his employment, that he'd reign supreme. Unfortunately for him, Hiryu was the lone survivor of the Strider culling, and he once again makes his way to Meio during the events of Strider 2. You're probably wondering, how can Hiryu be alive if Strider 2 canonically takes place 2,000 years after the first game, right? In the game's ending sequence, Meio, in exasperation, sees Hiryu up close and realizes that the Hiryu that stands before him is the spitting image of the one that defeated him in the original game, and wonders how it's possible. Strider then kills Meio, refuses to elaborate, and leaves. Remember when I said earlier that Hiryu was just an assumed name for him as a Strider? Well, the Strider Hiryu visual chronicle art book implies that Hiryu is in fact a nickname shared between the two Striders, and despite the resemblance, are two different but similar looking people. Strider 2's character designer even stated that they made sure not to draw the original one identically to the new one in Meio's little flashback sequence to the first game in the ending. This was a plot point that was never really revisited, until Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite decided to take its own unique spin on it. In the game's story mode, during the hero's attempt to obtain the Infinity Stones, a team makes their way to Knowmoon, where the Power Stone resides. Strider, however, splits off from the group as he has a personal mission: exterminate the person using Knowmoon as a base, Grandmaster Meio. Gamora, a fellow assassin, tags along with him and asks what his deal is, and surprisingly, they pick up that thread from Strider 2 somewhat. According to Hiryu, he and Meio are essentially locked in a cycle of death and rebirth, the latter always being resurrected and the former always being reincarnated to stop him. Hiryu mentions that he's died 1,000 deaths and speculates that his fate is somehow tied to Meio's. Told you that the Ouroboros thing was going to come back later. Which, honestly, really cool spin on that. Despite being based off the Strider 2 ending, I should note that it probably doesn't canonically represent anything from the Strider series proper, and that this explanation only applies to the Marvel version of Hiryu we see in Infinite, but it's cool all the same. Interestingly enough, while Strider has his traditional design in Marvel Infinite, Meio's design is actually taken from the 2014 game. There, while being a reboot, the general premise of the game is still the same. Meio bad, Strider good, kill Meio, yay freedom. There's an additional twist there though that also depicts Meio as a kind of extraterrestrial being, as he has a monstrous second form in the boss fight against him. Meio himself is working on behalf of Ultron Sigma in Infinite, specifically helping him along in his plan to infect the world with the Sigma virus. To this end, he's somehow able to capture and rewrite Zero's programming, converting him into his enforcer, Oblivion. Meio appears in Namco Cross Capcom with a design that combines aspects from both his Strider 1 and 2 incarnations. He's also a card in Heroes and Heralds and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, this time being based off of the first game. The Strider affiliated stage in the game and the location where this all takes place is Knowmoon. This stage is a combination of Nowhere from the Marvel Universe and the Third Moon, Grandmaster Meio's base of operations in the Strider series. The merging of the Capcom and Marvel universes seems to have caused both places to, instead of seamlessly combine, physically crash into each other instead. And man, if I had a nickel for every time that's happened in the crossover. In the Marvel universe, Nowhere is the severed head of a Celestial, giant, incredibly powerful godlike beings responsible for creating most of the Marvel universe. Over tens of thousands of years, people made their way to the Celestial head and colonized it, naming it Nowhere, and it became a scientific hub for people to observe ongoings from the edge of the universe. On the other hand, the Third Moon is the stronghold of Grandmaster Meio. Containing technology far beyond anything that can be reasonably found on Earth, the Third Moon is typically a space fortress that serves as the final playable level in most Strider games. It's also the fortress that can be seen in front of the moon in the Neo St. Petersburg stage in Marvel 1. Given the way it's oriented, this specific cameo might be a shout out to this old piece of promo art from the OG game. The Third Moon also shows up in Namco Cross Capcom as well, as the setting for a late game chapter or two, and can even be seen in the game's opening animation sequence. In Marvel Infinite, you can see the giant celestial head lodged into the walls of the Third Moon itself. Eerie. On top of all of the likely crimes against humanity Meio's plotting up here, there's also tons of Ultron drones that can be seen flying around in the background en masse. There's a giant spear to the right of the stage in the background where the Power Stone is being held in the story. This giant spear is a Gravitron device which come from the Strider games. They're a recurring obstacle, usually involving a boss set piece where Hiryu has to traverse through increasingly manipulated gravity in order to destroy it. They serve as mini-bosses in Strider 1, 2, and the 2014 game, but also get increased importance in that last one. There's 3 giant ones scattered throughout the game world, and taking them offline is what allows access to Meio's tower and the Third Moon. The final battle against Meio Prime, his final form in the same game, also incorporates these Gravitrons into the fight itself, and navigating them is key to finding openings. In the story mode, removing the Power Stone from here initiates a failsafe maneuver where the Third Moon will eject a payload containing the Sigma virus onto the Earth. It's essentially a modified version of Sigma's overall plan from Mega Man X5. Pretty neat callback. In the background of the platform where the fighters are, There's what appears to be some kind of giant emblem with a crescent moon incorporated into the design, so I'm sure it's meant to represent Knowmoon. There's also another variant of the stage as well, though it's a lot more unremarkable since there's only Ultron drones flying around in the background. Here are all of Strider's interactions in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite.
No place for amateurs.
Get the hell off me!
Your daughter Gamora will thank you for this.
Surrender all hope. Your ruler has arrived.
I am the hunter. You are my prey.
Inferior, I will show you a new world where machines rule.
Together, we are invincible.
Target confirmed. Need 3 minutes to clear.
Strider Hiryu.
I put my trust in your command.
Strider Hiryu.
You have my thanks.
Strider Hiryu.
This is not the day for kindness. For all you have done, you shall taste my blade.
Why try to fight us? We who are God.
Build your true nature. Now I will end your existence.
Do you think you can defeat us? Ready.
It goes without saying that Strider is one of the series' most popular characters, but in a lot of ways, he's one of the few characters I'd say actually kind of makes up the heart of the series. He's, in my opinion, the platonic ideal of how characters should be implemented in and benefit from crossovers. Strider 2 and Strider 2014 were both directly stated to exist because of his Marvel vs. Capcom appearances, and that's cool as hell. I think when it comes to crossover games, there's always a part of us that wants to see a character get in, partly because we like them, but also because no matter how much we may not want to admit it, there's a small part of us that hopes that maybe, just maybe, it could spark a revival for that character series. Strider fans can at least say they've lived that dream more than once. It also bears mentioning that the Versus games also informed some parts of the 2014 Strider game as well. A lot of his animations there are direct references to how certain attacks are depicted in Marvel vs. Capcom, like his charge cipher attack essentially being Graham. If the Versus series ever gets a new game proper, Strider is one of the few non-fighting game characters I'm confident will be represented no matter what. And hey, we might get a new Strider game out of that too. That said, that's going to do it for this video. As always, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.